if we want to avoid artificial subsidies, what's going to happen when the stimulus money in the clean tech sector runs out? Is there going to be a huge recession, depression in clean tech?
I'll answer that second question first. No. And I would like to add to Michael's point that all of industry and all of business today is finally beginning to focus on efficient ways of accomplishing whatever it is they've been trying to do for the last 50 years. Until recently, companies, manufacturers have simply not paid attention to efficiency. Resources were cheap, machinery was cheap, electricity was cheap, so all they cared about was improving production. To the extent that American industry and business begins to concentrate on the most efficient way to produce goods and services, the carbon output of each of those enterprises will dwindle dramatically. And if there is indeed injected into that system an added incentive of carbon trading credits, you'll see efficiency improve that you would never have thought possible before.
Mayor?
Yeah, I want to tell you what a dramatic change this is, because I have a little bit of history here. When I was a much younger person in the early 70s, I actually worked in the state legislature. I drafted the legislation to require Title 24 and had the unique experience of having to go to the Energy Commission and implement it. This is the standards that require energy efficiency standards for buildings and appliances all over the state of California, something that's really helped the state remarkably over the last 35 years. But back in the day, you had to make an argument he just made, that you have to have life cycle cost perspective, that you want to be able to install energy efficient systems so it would actually save the occupant or the user of the building or whatever over the life cycle of that structure. You would not believe how difficult it was to try to persuade people of that. You heard all the same arguments you hear now about AB 32. It's, it's going to ruin the industry, the housing market's going to crash, put people out of business, put people out of work, all that stuff. And I'm not saying those arguments are not important to address, but in fact, none of that happened. In fact, we created a whole different industry, and we created a conservation ethic in California, where now energy efficiency is at the top of the loading order. I used to have an energy commission who I loved dearly, but he used to always belittle us and say, well, you don't plug your TV into conservation. And I never actually knew what that meant, but nevertheless, he would say stuff like that, and you just say, this stuff really does make sense. And that one single phrase in the standards, that they're to be cost effective on a life cycle basis, has made a change. And now it's gotten to the point where, as you just heard, everyone is conscious of it. Everyone in business is now looking at, what are my resource costs going to be? And the advantage of AB 32, whether or not you believe any of this stuff about global warming, put that aside for a moment. Won't even address that. The policies coming out of it make sense. The policies on renewables, the policies on efficiency, they not only make sense from an environmental standpoint, they make sense from an economic standpoint. Think of this. California's electrical use per capita is 1/2 for the rest of the country. Half the rest of the country. Not entirely from the standards, but a large portion of that effect came from adopting those standards in 1976. We would have a housing stock from 1976, let's say for the next 30 years, that would have been built with, it would have been, let's say, a lack of any thermal integrity in most of those structures. And I remember what they were building. They were building houses with, if anything, an inch or two of insulation in the ceiling and nothing in the walls, in areas where you had many, very high degree days during the summer, temperatures over 100 degrees. So this stuff, you have to think of this in a little different way. You're building over a long period of time capital equipment that has long lifetimes. And whether it's buildings or whether it's production lines or whatever it is, it's important to keep moving on this renewable and conservation ethic. And things like 32 and carbon issues really help force that. So I think it's positive.
I'm going to try again, David, with you. if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on your no as to why the end of the stimulus won't have a large negative impact in the clean tech sector. But in answering it, if you could also, when we talked earlier, you had mentioned about being careful about the phenomena like the ethanol bubble and, seeking holy grails and things like that. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more.
My assessment of the stimulus program as it has affected or could affect venture-backed companies is that we've seen almost zero effect to date. It doesn't mean it's not going to have an effect because Tesla's applied for hundreds of millions. I've got 2 companies of my own here who have applied for close to $1 billion worth of, with partners who have applied to, for hundreds of millions of dollars worth of grants and or loans, and that will help them get into production on their products and get scaled up. That's simply just going to prove that some of these technologies can be scaled up. Guess what? Not every one of those battery companies that gets $500 million from the DOE and puts a plant in Michigan is going to stay in business. 1 or 2 of them is going to fail. But that's okay. I mean, it's worth it. I mean, if we can build an efficient electric battery manufacturing industry in this country, it'll be tremendous. I happen to care who wins, but that doesn't matter as long as somebody does. And I think that that money will be what we used to call in the medical industry a bolus, and work its way through the system. And some of these companies will be able to scale up, and then others will simply say that it's possible and go off and do it on their own without that money. Because Tesla was going to do it somehow or other before the stimulus money came. Fisker was going to get it somehow or another before the stimulus money came. And some of our companies, we don't. That's what you do in the American economy. You figure out how to raise the money and how to get your products into the marketplace.
And can you explain to people what you meant when you were referring to me about avoiding the corn to ethanol bubble and the Holy Grail?
Oh, well, Cleantech first claimed some cachet in the 4 to 5 year ago period when people started saying, gee, look at all the money going into Cleantech this year, $5 billion, $6 billion, $8 billion. 80% of those numbers were going into ethanol plants in Iowa and Nebraska and Wisconsin and so forth, and that was Cleantech because they were making ethanol out of corn, which is what moonshiners have been doing for 200 years. And those plants cost $80, $100, $200 million. So, I mean, it didn't take too many of those ethanol plants to use up a few $1 billion of that. Likewise, there were large solar and wind projects being done, also in the $50, $100, $150 million scale, so that between ethanol and the photovoltaics and wind projects, there was 85 to 90% of the money going into Cleantech. And then we had the ethanol bubble burst because of what's called the double commodity risk. The corn price rose suddenly, and the gasoline prices went down, and now your cost of goods is higher than your end product, and you look across a ruin-filled ethanol landscape right now. So there was a bubble there, just like there was in the internet in 2000.